been like a whirlwind, just getting everything rolling and stuff. And yeah, I went from full just like research and academia and decided to kind of venture into this space, which is very different. And so I'm kind of learning on the fly.
Yeah. When did you start the Instagram?
So I started it in August 1st, 2026 was when I made my first post, which is funny because
Yeah.
I looked back on it recently and was like, this is terrible.
I mean, that's like, yeah, I mean, you seem to post a lot of content which gets a lot of shares and a lot of comments and like really valuable stuff. Like, it's always hard. And Soph and I talk about a lot, like being a health professional and like wanting to convey science that is like easy to digest, not
Yeah.
too clickbaity, but also like captivates people. Like, it's always so hard to put things in bite-sized pieces. So, and you
Mhm.
seem to do that really well. So, it's very impressive.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think we all do it. We all have our own style. I try and be like, it's interesting because I feel like when I'm filming content, it's like there's one thing when you're presenting, like, or when you're making content, there's almost like a voice or a personality that comes off that maybe isn't real. So it's always funny to me because like, if you talk to me or you interact with me or you take one of my classes, like at the university, it's a much different experience. Like, I'm infinitely more
Yeah,
candid and just easygoing.
of course. Yeah.
But no, I agree. And it's always tough too, because it's like, oh, I really want to talk about the winding filament model with Titan. And I'm like, nobody is going to care about that. So I'm not going to talk about that. So it's always a balance. But how long have y'all been kind of podcasting and making content and stuff?
Yeah, just over 5 years now. We started like end of 2020, I think. So yeah, we're about 200 and something episodes in, and yeah, it's been really cool. We get to meet really cool people like you and learn so much from people, and there's a nice little community as well, which we get to kind of interact with each week. And we've got a really nice audience who are really keen to. They're kind of recreational runners, but they love to learn and they love understanding. I'm sure you just meet runners all the time who are like really keen to understand the physiology and the numbers and the why behind everything they do, and
You're
they don't
being
want to
you're
just
being
run and not think
gentle.
about it.
Like, I wouldn't say that they're just keen to
Obsessive?
learn. Yeah, obsessive, nerdy, dorks.
Yes, yeah, you're right.
Runner
Obsessive.
runners are just, yeah, they're just dorks. And I'm one of them, so I can say that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
that's awesome.
Alrighty, team. Welcome back to the Strong Side podcast. We are very excited today because we have the one and only Dr. Bill Evans, who has a PhD in exercise physiology with over 20 published peer-reviewed papers. And he is the founder and coach at the Endurance Lab, where he focuses on very evidence-based training for endurance runners. And we're very excited. So welcome to the show, Dr. Bill Evans.
Awesome. Super glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
We are so excited to have you on. We love your content and think that, yeah, everyone should follow you and find out more about what you do, because you are super knowledgeable, but you also have a way of breaking that down for the everyday person to understand. So we appreciate that as everyday people. Do you mind letting the listeners know a little bit more about yourself, how you got into exercise physiology, what you're up to at the moment at the university, kind of what your day-to-day looks like now?
Yeah, so sure. So my background is in ex-phys, as you pointed out. I did my master's at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, which is in the United States. And then when I was there, I actually studied the immune system and sedentary behavior, which is as exciting as it sounds. So I studied, yeah, it was super boring. I literally put people in a chair and had them sit for 3 hours, and then I would measure non-invasive measures of their cardiovascular health. So specifically their arterial stiffness. I also measured cognition and cognitive function, specifically executive functioning with something called a Stroop test. And then we measured everything in between. So inflammatory markers, postnatal stem cells. And then I transitioned to University of Maryland in College Park, again in the States. And I spent 5 years there studying specifically systemic inflammation in the context of heart failure. So I gave rats heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, and then I isolated their skeletal muscle, I imaged it, I fiber typed it, and I assessed the inflammatory profile. We haven't published the final paper from that dissertation. We've published the first two, just investigating what a very large inflammatory bout will do to the muscle, and then kind of some sex differences in males and female rats specifically as it relates to the presentation of heart failure. And the final paper is more the mechanistic one. lightly mechanistic that kind of looks at the inflammatory pathways and specifically muscle-derived macrophages, which are my favorite cell that I never get to talk about because nobody wants to talk about those. They want to talk about running. I'm an avid runner. I got into running when I was a kid and I had back surgery when I was 18. So I could have used a good physio, but I didn't know any better. And I was told that, I shouldn't run anymore. So I didn't. And I quit for about 8 years until I picked it up again my first year of my second program at Maryland. And I just kept rolling with it. I kept training and eventually ended up, getting decent enough to be competitive again. And so I really kind of turned up my training of the past like 5-ish years. And in that time, I've also started working at the university I'm at now, which is Elon University, not Elon Musk, not affiliated. Everyone thinks it is, but yeah, it's Elon University in North Carolina, where I'm an assistant professor of exercise science. And I study now, when I'm there, I've kind of transitioned my research to more applied research. So I study mitochondrial capacity, which I'm happy to explain all about, as well as the effect of double threshold training versus traditional high intensity interval training on male and female physiology. So lactate threshold, VO2 max, as I said, mitochondrial capacity. And we're also exploring athlete burnout as well as menstrual health, obviously in the females, and seeing if there's any relationships between the features of those training types, the inflammatory profiles, and the actual physiological outcomes. So that is kind of where I'm at now. And the other tiny thing that I do is I post on Instagram a lot about running, and I just share all the nerdy running things that I read about and the things that I've learned through the years or different papers that I find interesting, with the idea of somewhat maybe myth busting some of these age old arguments or thoughts, or providing a little more evidence to support certain ideas that we have in the running community. So maybe it's around zone 2 training or lactate threshold, or what is VO2 max? How do you actually measure it? What does it really mean, as opposed to just looking at your Garmin and being like, 65, that's pretty good. And so I've been doing it for only about 5 or 6 months, since August. I have an identical twin brother, and he is very much in this online space. He encouraged me to do it. I told him no, and then he did it again and again and again. And after 4 years, I cracked and finally was like, you know what? I'll make some content. And so here I am on a podcast where I'm incredibly underqualified to be here. So that's pretty happened. So what other questions do you have?
We have so many questions,
Sorry.
and even just based on what you just said, there are like almost every single word you just said, I just want to ask more about. And you mentioned mitochondrial capacity, and there's so many things that we could ask you. I feel like we might need to get you back on for a deep dive into so many different parts of everything you just mentioned and your current study as
macrophages.
well. Yes, we could do a whole episode on that if you
Don't
like.
forget.
Yeah.
But why don't we start with something that we really want to dive into today is about what limits muscular performance. So why do muscles fatigue or fail? Why do we slow down? Why do we struggle? What is initiating or influencing that fatigue? Is it central? Is it peripheral? What are the differences? How do we, I guess, improve that buffer? And yeah, there might be lots of different ways to kind of approach that question. But if we think about a runner who is going out for their run and then suddenly it gets really hard, or they slow down, or they need to stop, what is actually creating or causing that? What's happening physiologically, maybe psychologically? We might start from there and then see where we get to.
So apologies. I think there was a little delay, or you broke up there. What I heard was that you were asking about what happens physiologically or psychologically that drives either central or peripheral fatigue, and kind of breaking down those different fatigue mechanisms. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
Okay, awesome. So I will try and break this down from, as best I understand it, from kind of the top and kind of work our way down. So at the top, I generally think about fatigue as having either a central or a peripheral origin. And I think oftentimes when you think about the central component, people will conflate either the nervous system, which is going to be your brain, your motor neurons, your sensory neurons, with your heart, because your heart is central. And when we talk about oxygen consumption, which is measured by VO2, we talk about the central component, which is going to be your heart and lungs. And I would pretty much put both of those together in the central component. Generally, when people talk about central fatigue, they're talking about central nervous system fatigue. So we also know that generally speaking, the lungs are not going to limit your performance unless you have some pre-existing condition like COPD, chronic bronchitis. I don't know why you're racing on those things, emphysema or asthma. And then the heart is not usually going to be an area of fatigue as well because it is very good at consuming oxygen. It is very good at using lactate and it beats all day long. Your heart's not going to fatigue. I often tell people if I could take all of my skeletal muscle and turn it into one type of tissue, it would be cardiac tissue. The only problem is that I would constantly tremor every second when they would all beat. But it is, so in that context, central fatigue, I really am referring to central nervous system fatigue. Whereas when you think about peripheral fatigue, you're thinking about things more specific to the muscle. So usually people are going to refer to metabolic fatigue, mechanical fatigue, so a breakdown of those structural contractile proteins, actin, myosin. I'm not sure. There's some theories that maybe even titin plays a role, which is it's one of the biggest proteins in the body. And then also you've got, sorry if I said this already, but metabolic fatigue, mechanical fatigue, and then even potentially ionic imbalances, changes in calcium handling, which is the ability to move calcium into and out of a muscle cell. And then the one that I think is the most important is your inability to maintain oxygen delivery. And that would kind of fall under the metabolic one, but it's more upstream. And it really is central to determining your exercise capacity and your exercise performance. So I know there's a lot there, but fatigue is very complicated. And it's something that we don't have the answer to even today. If we had the answer to fatigue, there'd be no point in training because we would just take whatever magical drug or whatever magical intervention to try and prevent that fatigue from happening. So those are all the things that we know. And there's probably other things I haven't listed that people have shown there are studies on that kind of talk about this. So from there, I'm going to transition a little bit. So one theory that is very well supported is the central governor theory. And this was popularized by Tim Noakes. Even though he wasn't the original researcher who did the studies, he largely popularized it and theorized about it. And he's got some takes that I think some people are like, there's no way. Right now, he's really big on ketones and ketone diets. And so for runners, I would not recommend that. But maybe he would disagree with me. I don't know. My friend's in South Africa working in a lab next to his, so I'm going to ask her later this week about Tim Noakes' take on ketones. So the central governor theory, though, is basically this idea that your brain is actively repressing your skeletal muscle so that you do not push yourself beyond a limit that would result in some type of irreparable structural damage or fatigue. So again, we know that tissue has these structural properties, and so you can basically stretch out any tissue and you can see how stiff it is, you can see when it'll break, all that stuff. And so the idea is that your brain knows what that looks like, and it's actively trying to protect you from going past those points. And the classic example of this in a study was that they took, and I think it's a hilarious study because I try and imagine what this looked like in practice, but they basically took someone's finger and he did like a bunch of finger contractions in like the 1800s. And it's called twitch interpolation. And so they measured the amount of tension or force he was producing with his finger. And eventually it starts to drop off because he's producing force too rapidly. And then when he's really, really fatigued and he's not producing any force, they start shocking his finger basically with stim. And what they showed is that even when he voluntarily could not produce any more force, the stim was able to completely restore the force production back to baseline. Or back to the pre-exercise levels. And this suggests that there's something that is upstream of that stim because the stim is acting on the skin, which is going to go straight into the muscle to cause that contraction, that is actively preventing that muscle from contracting. And so what's upstream of that? And when I say upstream, I mean in the process of making any movement, and it's going to be your brain or those motor neurons. And so that series of studies, which has been replicated time and time again in a ton of different contexts, is where the central governor theory comes from. And it's why I often say that stress is such an important metric to track daily and your subjective feeling of exertion to monitor how you're feeling because it is going to directly determine the force output that you're going to have, which is going to directly determine your ability to run. That's a very long-winded way of explaining this, the kind of central governor theory and some of the underlying science. And I'm sure I'm missing some of it, but this is my understanding of it. And I think it's probably one of the ones that people like the most because it's this idea that if you just have a stronger mindset, you can
Mm.
overcome what your muscles are telling you, which is like somewhat true. Like it's not entirely true. The point is that your brain won't let you do that. But yeah, that's kind of one theory. Do you have any questions about that or follow up?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, it's so awesome. Like I find this stuff fascinating. Yeah, the central governor theory, I think what you just described about like people quite like that because it makes them feel like their brain can kind of like override our muscular fatigue. And my understanding is that we're getting feedback from our body to our brain, right? So because of that feedback, like part of like training is reducing how much I guess our muscles are telling us to slow down as well, right? Like it's not just as simple as like overriding that because obviously there's a point at which that you've reached the ceiling for that. When you talk about stress and monitoring stress, are you talking about monitoring our mechanical or metabolic stress, or are you talking about how we emotionally respond to these symptoms? What exactly are you talking about there, and what are ways of improving that as an athlete?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Stress is really multifactorial. As you pointed out, you've got this mechanical stress, you've got psychological stress. When I am referring to stress, I am thinking, imagine if I just asked you right now, hey, how stressed out are you? Scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most stressed out you've ever been, taking everything into account, your muscles, the way you're feeling, where your headspace is at, sensations, everything, sleepiness. How stressed out would you say you are? Answer.
I would say a 3.5, I reckon, right now. What do you reckon, Soph?
Yeah, I was thinking a 3.
3.
Wow.
Wow. Well,
I'm
that's
feeling.
pretty good. Usually when people talk to me, it's something more like an 8 or a 9. So I'll take a 3 as a total win right now.
Because you're so
Wow.
intimidating.
Yeah, no, I think I just like, I'm weird. So it can be
You make
stressful.
people stressed.
Yeah, because I'm super weird. But so when I think about stress, I tend to think of it as a comprehensive metric because if we were to measure, say, your cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone released by your adrenal gland, and it is kind of the classical stress hormone, we would see that it does align with that subjective experience of stress to a point. And so we know that the subjective experience is actually very powerful. Like how you feel, if like one of the best things you can do is just take an inventory of how you're feeling, which is sounds so simple. It sounds like a ridiculous concept. So like, oh, just ask yourself how you're doing because you're not going to do that. That's kind of a weird thing to do. We're not taking self inventory. We're not asking ourselves, how am I feeling? How do my legs feel? How is my headspace? We're like, I know that I have to run 7 miles today and 4 of them have to be at this pace. And if they're not, then I'm a failure. And I think that's where the reframing comes into it to try and reframe those negative thoughts into something that's more productive. And so, yes, we do have the physiological stress, the muscle soreness, the mechanical stress, the neural fatigue, just from like lack of sleep. But when I think of stress and when I refer to stress holistically is how I am referring to it as if we were going to do a Likert scale of, how you're feeling. And in terms of like methods to mitigate that stress, I think you first need to be aware of it. If you don't know how stressed out you are, then you're not going to have any way of addressing it. And from there, there's very like classical examples of improving those parameters. So box breathing is kind of the textbook example of reducing stress. And then from there, you can think about reframing or visualization. Those are all techniques that sports psychologists have used to kind of reduce those sensations of anxiety especially before a workout or something like that.
Super interesting. Something that I have often thought about is like before a race, there is like kind of this spectrum of like calm and stress, and like everyone probably has somewhere different that they would like to sit ideally. And some people get more stressed more easily, so they benefit from trying to stay relaxed, right? And others, like I feel like Soph is like too relaxed and would benefit from the opposite, because there's been several times when Soph has missed her race start because she's too relaxed. And so like
Just taking in the atmosphere, soaking up the vibes. I'm at the start line. I just didn't realize the race had started.
So, like, is there an optimum for performance, and does it depend on distance, right? Because, like, I imagine if you're a 100-meter sprinter, see, I don't know, but like, you need to be really focused and, like, I don't know. I guess it is just a real, yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Is there a science to that?
Yeah, there's always going to be like a U-shaped curve, right? There's always going to be some
Yeah.
point at which, like, if you're too chill, it's not going to help you. If you're too stressed out, it's not going to help you. And I tend to think about this like caffeine, right? This is to me the kind of
Mm.
classic example. We know that caffeine helps you with almost every event, helps you in the 100, helps you in the marathon, helps you in the 10K, 5K. It is an ergogenic aid and it should be banned by WADA. No. But it is a really effective. No, it is a very effective ergogenic aid. I always tell people caffeine is the number one go-to if you're trying to increase your performance. And so if you drink caffeine and you wake up in the morning and you're sleepy and groggy, that's this side of the curve, right? You're not prepared. Your
Mm.
nervous system is not firing. You don't have any level of excitatory presynaptic potentials, which is just a complicated way of saying your nervous system is primed and ready to roll, right? When you roll out of bed, not the case. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if you take a gram of caffeine, you are going to be itching out of your skin. You're going to be hyperventilating. You're going to be going to the bathroom too often. You're going to have you're going to be already operating at an intensity just to exist that is going to start to fatigue you, especially like your central nervous system is just going to be fried because you're not pacing it. You're just like, get after it. And so, I think there's always going to be an optimal level, and that is individualized to the athlete, which is why I tell people, especially athletes who have any level of race anxiety. When I say race anxiety, I don't just mean like nerves. I mean, almost an inability to get to the line and get to the finish line, right? I tell those athletes that they need to race as often as they can because exposures to that stressor and realizing that nothing bad is going to happen are going to help train that classically conditioned
Mm.
part of their body that says, racing hurts, my coach will be unhappy, I stink, and my times are bad. The more you do it, it's like exposure therapy, which is a gold standard therapy for obsessive compulsive disorder, where you like classic, like you're afraid of snakes, here's a snake. And it's hard to
Mm.
do. Like it's very challenging, especially with running, where it's a painful, like it's not, running hard is hard. Like it's objectively
Yeah.
hard. And so having a chance to do it more frequently is one of the best ways to improve your performance, reduce that anxiety. I mean, we know that if I do a VO2 max on both of you, you've probably seen this in the lab. And I do it on Monday, and then we test you again on Thursday, and you've never done it before, your VO2 max will be higher on Thursday. Not because you gained any more fitness, but simply because you learned how to do the test. And it's the same thing is true of racing. So that's kind of my approach when it comes to stress and how I encourage my athletes to overcome this. And even if that means going out and laying a goose egg, like, fine, you didn't run well, but you finished. And that's for you, that's a win because we were potentially not even going to get to the starting line.
Mm.
Sorry, did you say laying a goose egg?
Yeah, laying an
What
egg.
does that mean?
It just means
Can you have a breakdown of that, please?
like a big zero. Maybe it's something I picked up in Western Pennsylvania where I grew up, but it just means like a big zero,
No
a
good.
goose egg, a nothing burger. You didn't even put a time out there. You just didn't even get to the start line.
That's so good. We'll have to add that to our repertoire. The loyal listeners will know that Lydia and I are really bad with phrases and we always get them wrong. So we're going to start saying laying a goose egg whenever things go wrong. That's all the stress stuff is fascinating. I think it's such a key part of training and racing and becoming a better athlete. On the note of, I guess, improvements in performance, if we're to talk about someone's training season, whether they're a marathon runner or a 10K runner or whatever they do, the physiological, I guess, parameters or adaptations that they are aiming for, what should they start to think about? Because we hear a lot about the different training zones, lactate threshold, you mentioned double lactate threshold you're looking into in the research. If we're just talking about a recreational runner who wants to get a bit fitter, wants to get a bit faster, when they're training throughout the season, what kind of physiological adaptations are occurring? You mentioned mitochondrial capacity before, but what is actually happening if we start from running a 30-minute 5K and then 6 months later we're running a 25-minute 5K? What has actually changed or progressed or adapted in that process?
You just asked my favorite question, and I know you know the answer to this, but I appreciate you asking me it as if you don't. So first thing that's going to happen that we know is they're going to retain plasma volume. So that is the first adaptation that happens. It's also the first thing that you'll detrain with. And what that does is it increases the amount of fluid that your heart can pump, which is going to drive up cardiac output, which is going to increase your oxygen consumption. And so the Fick equation, I wish I had something to write with here. I actually do. Give me a second. I don't know if it'll work on this. It might be in reverse. I guess we'll see. But we know that VO2 equals cardiac output times the difference in oxygen from an artery, which generally has oxygenated blood, to a vein, which is basically the amount of oxygen that your muscles are kind of pulling out as it passes over them. And so this, it didn't show up, but that's it. It's also,
Yeah.
okay, it looks like it might be in reverse, but that's it. So that's the Fick equation. Greatest equation ever invented. Better than pi, 3.1415926535897932334664338379550.
Whoa.
That's probably, I'm probably like a
You
little.
could have just been making it up, to be honest. We
Look
don't
it up
know if that's
later.
true or not.
Play it
We need to
back
fact check
for the
that.
listeners. Fact check it. So what happens? Plasma volume increases first. That increases cardiac output. That is going to increase oxygen consumption. From there, you're going to start to see increases in mitochondrial enzymes, and they don't increase their activity. In other words, they don't get better at doing their job. You just make more of them. And how you make more of them is that you multiply the number or the amount of mitochondria. Fun fact about mitochondria, they are not tiny little jelly beans that we think they are. I don't know if that is like very well known, but they actually exist in a reticulum. So they exist in a kind of like a giant network. They look like a honeycomb or a beehive, and their structure determines their function. And we now know that depending on the shape that they have and how they orient themselves around capillaries, allows them to function in a certain way. And believe it or not, they're able to communicate based on with these electric potentials that travels across them so that they know whether or not they need to fuse together or break apart to like disrupt a signal. So all that to say, interesting little nugget, maybe not relevant for training, but hopefully it changes your mind on the powerhouse of the cell. So we know that those enzymes are going to increase. From there, you're going to start to see increases in cardiac parameters. So the left ventricle in particular is going to get thicker, but it's not going to grow inward, right? It's going to grow outward because when you're running, you're actually loading the heart eccentrically. In other words, the heart is kind of has this natural tension that it wants to exist against. And as you push fluid into it, you're causing it to eccentrically contract. You're forcing it against its natural bend. And so that is an eccentric overload, and it causes the heart to remodel outwards so that the chambers either maintain their size, and at the same time, the walls are getting thicker so you can increase contractility. Well, that will increase your stroke volume, which is the amount of blood pumped with each beat of the heart. That will drive up your VO2 as well. There's all sorts of changes, but the other thing that will happen is that you are going to start to see an increase in capillary density, which is the number of those very, very, very tiny, they're one red blood cell thick, incredibly thin blood vessels that are just all throughout your muscles. And on average, every muscle fiber has about 5 capillaries that touches them at any given time.
Wow.
And so when you train, that number goes up. And at the same time, your fibers get smaller. And what that does is it decreases the distance that oxygen has to travel to get to those mitochondria to make energy. And then there's all sorts of additional changes from there. So you can have changes in your threshold, the blanket on the word. It's like your threshold firing rate as well as your coordination. That coordination is going to contribute to running economy, which means that at any given VO2, you're more efficient, so you consume less oxygen. You're going to see what other adaptations? You're going to see increases in tendon stiffness. And we know that runners generally have, well, at least this is my understanding. You're more in this space. But I read in The Lore of Running last night by Tim Noakes that generally speaking, runners have more compliant tendons that are less stiff. But if you're doing the right training and you're actually doing strength training, specifically like very strong concentric work to thicken that tendon and then doing some level of plyometric, you're going to increase that tendon stiffness. That's going to give you more elasticity and more bounciness. That's going to help you.
Mm.
And generally speaking, all of these things are going to happen just by doing easy miles to start. Because you're starting, and Jack Daniels talks about this, but you're starting in a place when you have so much better that you can get. Like, I think people misunderstand how good they can get at running. Like, I always tell people, and this is a hot take, but I'm like, anybody can be an Olympian. And they're like, that's ridiculous. And I'm like, no, no, no. Like, if you started from the day you were born and we said, hey, everything you do from this day forward, we are going to dedicate to becoming an elite runner. I truly believe that anybody can be an elite runner. And I say that because out of 300, I think maybe it's 160 alleles. I can't remember. Out of like some large number of genes, they looked at all these different variants of the gene and alleles, and they showed that it was only able to explain like point some percent of the change in VO2 max. Like, basically, your genetics had no influence on your ability to consume oxygen. And so the other last thing that changes that's very important is your lactate threshold. And so that's just going to be an increase in these MCT receptors, monocarboxylate transporters, I believe is what they're called. Don't quote me on that. MCT 1 and 4 specifically, they exist in the heart and skeletal muscle primarily. And those are actually going to shuttle out the lactate specifically. Now, lactate doesn't cause fatigue, but in doing so, we can make that lactate into something useful like glucose and pyruvate, which is very important, as we know, to enter the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain that makes ATP. So I know that's like a very deep dive, and I know that is not very good at being like, this is the simple way to explain this. But
no, I love it.
But that is what I would say are the kind of the high level changes that we know happen. There's one other one. Your blood vessels get really good at directing blood, and delivery of blood flow is the rate limiting step for metabolism. So you're going to not just build more capillaries, but you're also going to be able to open up and close those blood vessels better to redistribute blood to where it needs to go so you don't have any level of inefficiency. And I rest my case. No, that was a...
You should be a teacher. Have you considered that?
I just taught this to my students.
Explained. Yeah, I would love to come to your classes. All of that information is just fascinating. So interesting. You mentioned there that you can achieve all of those adaptations initially through easy running, and there's a lot of potential that you can get, I guess, from being a beginner to just doing easy miles, easy kilometers. When does the harder, more intense, faster running become relevant? And are there different changes once you get into those higher intensity efforts? Is there benefit to all runners doing hard training, or could they get away with just running easy forever? Is there kind of a potential or a limiter on that?
Yeah, there is. There absolutely is. So I think everyone's different, as we know. There are some general kind of like rules of thumb that I tend to think about. Once someone is running about, and I know you're in kilometers, so I'll do my best to fix my numbers. So once someone is running about, 50 kilometers a week, that's 30-ish miles, right? Yeah. So once you're getting to 50, 60, 70 kilometers a week, you're starting to hit that 30, 40, 50 mile range. Now you're getting to a place where you actually have a considerable amount of volume accumulated in your runs. You still have a long way to go. So Arthur Lydiard was Peter Snell's coach, and he tested this out anecdotally because he was a crazy milkman who lived in New Zealand. And he ran all the way up to 200 miles a week. He played with it. He was like, wow, I'm going to run this many. And so anecdotally, and this is rare, we don't know this very often, but essentially what he and Peter Snell discovered is that around 100 miles a week that seems to be both a convenient, easy to remember, and a good amount of running in terms of volume. That's like, if you run 100 miles a week, I have met few people that are bad runners when they run 100 miles a week. Usually, if you're running that much, you're going to be good at it. But around that 50 kilometer range and up is when I would start to introduce intensity, because you're not going to have the intensity is very important for continuing to drive up your stroke volume, your capillary density, those mitochondrial enzymes, because the main stressor that you need to have is hypoxia, which is a low oxygen concentration, because that is going to stimulate a molecule called HIF-1 alpha. It's hypoxia-inducible factor 1, and it essentially does all these things to increase the number of blood vessels because it eventually increases something called VEGF. That makes more blood vessels. And as I said before, the ability to redistribute blood and the amount of capillaries are the primary limiter of exercise performance. And so when you start to introduce that intensity, you increase the intensity of that stimulus so that you start to get more capillaries, which is a primary determinant. The other thing that's going to happen is you need to stimulate PGC1 alpha, which is a master regulator of mitochondrial density. And again, the things that stimulate that are going to be things like free radicals, which are going to essentially, they're these tiny little electrons that make their way out of the mitochondria and they cut through cell membranes like a hot knife through butter. And they're like dominoes. And what happens is when those start doing that, they stimulate transcriptional machinery to start increasing mitochondria because they don't want to produce free radicals. And so you start to increase PGC1 alpha. And that is why intensity is very important. And so there's a classic study that looked at changes in VO2 max, lactate threshold, and running economy, the three most important determinants of performance. And what they showed is that easy running was able to increase VO2 max, right? Or I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. It was able to increase running economy. Lactate threshold training was able to increase running economy and lactate threshold. VO2 max training was able to increase lactate threshold, running economy, and VO2 max, which is all three determinants. However, if you introduce those in the wrong order, you risk or you reduce your ceiling because you are treating a runny nose with the strongest antibiotic ever created. And so maybe you gain 3 minutes off your 5K from easy running, 3 minutes off your 5K from threshold, and 3 minutes off your 5K from VO2 max. And so you say, well, VO2 max is the most intense. I'm going to do that first. And so maybe you lose 5 minutes off your 5K. You just do VO2 max. And then you go back and you try and do threshold. And then you're like, I'll finish up with easy running. Well, by the time you get to easy running, you've detrained your VO2 max because the threshold intensity wasn't high enough to sustain the adaptation that the VO2 max did. And so you're not going to see over the course of that time span the same level of adaptation, which is why periodization is so crucial. Like you have to build the machinery and then peak someone at the right time so that they don't detrain these very, very specific, very intense physiological parameters. Or sorry, these physiological parameters that will only increase in response to intense training that can't be maintained across a year.
Yeah, super fascinating. So if someone is trying to improve their performance in, I guess let's use a 5K as an example, but just overall, like they're running 50Ks a week or 30 miles, they've got that base, like should they be looking to add that threshold and VO2 max like as an addition for a certain period and then go back into just easy miles again? Like is it something that would come and go, or like once you're at that volume, you can have that in your week to week, every month, every season?
So if I'm understanding correctly, like you're saying that once they get to their VO2 max, should they back their mileage back off? Is that
no,
like once they
like if you're at a point where you have capacity to have threshold training and VO2 max training and you've got that easy base there, should that be cycled so you then reduce the intensity, keep your base mileage during certain periods and then build that back up? And is that sort of faster stuff just what is going to be coming and going, and that bulk stuff mostly stays intact?
Yeah, 100%, right? And the classic detraining studies by who did that study? Ed Coyle, I think, did it. He was in John Halsey's lab. Sorry if you can hear my daughter in the back. She's really upset about something. I don't know what. But you know what? It's fine. Everything's going to be fine. I say that sitting here on the other end of the camera, like, everything's good. I don't care if you leave this in. I'm pretty honest. I'm probably going to get beat when I leave, though. Anyways, no, I'm joking. So what happens is that the intensity you can't sustain, right? You can't sustain VO2 max training all year round. You will get hurt. And if you don't get hurt from doing VO2 max training all year round, then you're doping. That's the only logical explanation. That's like the only way you could handle that. And so you have to go back into that phase. And additionally, like there's always room to add, right? Like I said, 100 miles a week is a ceiling, is a one ceiling that we know, unless you're running a marathon and you're Kelvin Kiptum, rest in peace, or Eliud Kipchoge or whatever, then, you know, like that 100 miles is probably good for almost every event. And so that's a time when you can go back and do that. And then you can still supplement in things to improve your running economy, like your, you know, like strides or whatever the case is. And so there, you can sprinkle in that intensity, and that's where you might do some undulating periodization or something like that, where you up the intensity and then drop it, or maybe you have like a certain microcycle for a certain purpose. But things they have to go up and down because you can't sustain that intensity. And ideally, you're raising your floor so that when you start back for that easy training, you're starting from a like kind of a different level.
Why can't you sustain that? Why is faster running so risky? Why can't we do it all year round? Why is it so dangerous?
So it has to do, as I feel like you asked me these questions knowing the answer, but I'll answer it anyways.
I'm asking on behalf of the listeners.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're going to run too intensely, the impulses, the vertical ground reaction forces are very, very high. And especially like most of your listeners are probably, as you said, they're somewhere between the age of 20, 40, whatever, I don't know. But as you age, your ability to tolerate very high vertical ground reaction forces, especially frequently, gets lower and lower. And so it's a tissue tolerance, right? Your tissue is not going to tolerate that level of loading that frequently for that long. The other thing is that your volume will eventually drop because and this is a tissue thing, but it's also physiological. We know that if you continue to overreach and overreach and overreach, you're eventually going to overtrain, and then you're going to see performance drop. So there is certainly merit in taking downtime, taking time. I mean, even taking time completely off, because the adaptations, like when you build capillaries, they stick around. Even if you detrain completely, the capillaries don't really go away. It's the enzymes that change, and those come back quick. So, like it's the tissue, but then even just the nervous system, some of the endocrine changes, especially in females, like it's not good to be amenorrheic. So, and that intensity can often produce that. So it's, you have to kind of take all these things in stride.
I guess just a little bit more on that detraining. I think this is something that Soph and I have spoken about a bit together and on the show. How long do you need off until you're going to take a long time to get fit again? I mean, we're both coming back from
I'm sorry to
both
pause you real quick.
injuries.
Give me 1 minute
okay.
to just check on things. I will be right back. I'm so sorry. Hold on.
Yeah. We're all good.
Yeah, I don't know how much feedback you're going to hear from my children, but you know what? This is just honest. It's the real world of people. And I hate the idea that we are just sitting in our house in a quiet home, just working peacefully on all of these things.
So it's lots of facades in social media. Yeah.
I'm here to break it down. Both my children are in hysterics and my wife is upset. But it's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. The listeners will understand.
They will.
I really don't care how much of this you leave in.
What I wanted to hear a little bit about is detraining. Obviously, you started your career researching sedentary behavior. And I mean, I find it very, very fascinating just how important, like, for our general health, like, movement is. And we know that being sedentary is really bad for us. And I think it's just not usually something that runners have to worry too much about, in the sense of, like, make sure you exercise to look after your health, because usually the issue is doing too much, right? But in saying that, there's seasons where people have injuries for a really long time, or they're limited with cross-training options, or they go away, or, all sorts of seasons of life, having children, and they have extended time off. You said that our capillary network is usually going to remain intact, but the enzymes are changing. Yeah, what else are we losing? And like, what are the timeframes for regaining? Because I can speak for both probably Soph and I that after having a lot of time off running the last year and the last like 5 years, I feel really unfit, and I don't feel like anything has stayed intact. Like, running's bloody hard, and I'm like, how did I used to find it so easy? So yeah, I would love to know, how long have I got slugging it out until I'm elite?
Well, running is hard, and unfortunately, detraining is just a part of training. And the thing about detraining is to remember that some of these structural changes, like even increases in the myonuclei, which are associated with muscle hypertrophy, generally speaking, those nuclei don't go away, right? Because that was a satellite cell that kind of put itself where it needed to be. And so you still have the machinery in place, ideally. And some people debate this because it's very hard to test. But you should still have the machinery in place to build back quicker. Now, it's still hard, right? So to answer one of your questions about detraining. So within 60 days of bed rest, So one of the classic examples is they took astronauts and they were trying to understand what would happen in space because they couldn't exercise in space. And they put them on like complete bed rest. And I forget how long, but let's just say it's like a month or two. The changes in their oxygen consumption were worse than 40 years of aging. So that's not great. Yeah. They also showed in a different study that when you detrain for 60 days, you can lose up to 20 or 30% of your VO2 max. However, after they put these individuals through 8 to 10 weeks of training, intense training, granted, like they were doing the Hickson protocol, which is brutal. I think it's like 5 on, 2 minutes off at VO2 max. Essentially, it's VO2 max intervals. And this is on a bike, so it's more sustainable. They were able to increase their VO2 max all the way back to where they were before they detrained. And that was within 10 to 12 weeks. And so generally the adaptations happen every 3 weeks, and then the fourth week is a plateau week. So in other words, if you do intense training, and again, you still have to train, right? You have to progressively increase your volume, ideally volume first and then intensity. And then that fourth week should be a maintenance week, kind of with the idea of letting the tissue adapt, almost like a down week. And then you increase load again. And again, 3 weeks later, your VO2 max will increase. And the fourth week, it will plateau. Increase that load again. And over 12 weeks, the VO2 max continued to increase. But again, this was Mr. Intensity Robert Hickson. And so that's ideally if you can sustain that level of intensity, which is, as I said before, not necessarily sustainable. It increases burnout and all these other things. So with that being said, I generally tell people that anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks of good aerobic base building, and that means building volume, not just running, but increasing the mileage week over week, will get you to a place where you can start to increase intensity. And once you increase that intensity, generally speaking, again, within, I would say, because you already see some adaptations, within 4 to 8 weeks of hard, difficult training, you're going to be tip-top shape, ready to roll. And so what is that, like 18 weeks? So that's 3-ish, 4-ish months. And you can accelerate that timeline if you accelerate your volume. Now, that has to be done carefully. It should involve some level of cross-training. And again, you don't want to just jump to the last stage. It should be very progressive. But again, that's assuming you were totally detrained, you had no adaptation. If you were trained before and you get back into it and you get back up to that volume within a month, which is reasonable for some people, a month to 6 weeks. Your physios, you'd probably say that's ill-advised, but, teach their own. You can usually increase their intensity from there. And within 2 months, 2.5 months, they can be back pretty much to where they were, even if they were totally detrained.
Wow. It's it's kind of inspiring. I'm like, yeah, wow, like this is awesome. Like, let's go do some intensity. Let's train hard. But yeah, as a physio, like the barrier is always like risk of re-injury. And I always am very conservative with my approach to returning to running because yeah, our tissue capacity is like such a big thing in that risk of injury. But I think what you said about cross training being a great way to do that, because if someone is doing this intensity on the bike and with the cross trainer, the elliptical, and they're running and they're using the rower, like they're diversifying their movement patterns, I imagine they're still going to be getting pretty much all of those benefits, right? On like an enzyme level, capillaries, like all that stuff is going to be much the same.
100%. Like I have some athletes with history of osteoporosis or osteopenia. And with those athletes, most of their training is going to come on the elliptical. And I like the elliptical. A lot of people don't because it is a similar movement pattern to running. I know it's different. Like I know we could poke holes in it, but like the elliptical to me is more similar than cycling in terms of the position that you're in, right? Because when you're cycling, oftentimes you're leaned over, right? And so we know that when you're horizontal to the ground, the vertical distance with your heart and your muscles is lower. So your heart's pumping against different pressures. Same thing with swimming, but it's aerobic work. And like, I often tell people, especially early, work is work. You don't need to get that specific until you're like 8 weeks out. You just don't. Like you're gonna, once you get specific, you're gonna get very fit very fast and you can't sustain it. So just do the work until you're like 8-ish weeks out and then start to get specific. And again, that comes with good training, good coaching, a good physio or physical therapist that's going to walk you through what's appropriate, what level of intensity you can handle. Like if you have an Achilles injury, don't throw on a pair of 800-meter spikes and start ripping 200. Like that's dumb, but people will do that because they're impulsive.
No, that's really helpful. It is all just really interesting, and it does feel inspiring to know that there is so much that we can do. And yeah, both Liz and I have had a few injuries recently, and some time off,
Oh,
and it's nice to know that we can get back to where we were. And yeah, it is a really careful balance, right? Like we understand that physiologically we can improve quite quickly, but yeah, maybe our tissues lag behind a little bit. So finding that balance is an ongoing battle, I guess, for all runners. But yeah, it's super interesting to hear and understand in a lot more detail about what is actually happening within our different systems, our bodies, and knowing that yeah, running can be hard, but it will get easier as we adapt, and we'll then just continue to make our workouts harder. So I guess it'll always be hard, but yeah, we really appreciate everything you've shared today, and there's so much content. I mean, you've only been posting since August, but there are so many fantastic reels on your page already that
oh.
are so informative, and you somehow managed to put all of this information into 30, 60 seconds. And yeah, it's really fascinating. So we'll have your Instagram linked below for people to check out. And where anything else you want to plug? Your coaching business, is that something that people can access from Australia, or is that?
Yeah, no, it is. Thank you so much for the kind words. I really appreciate it. And I must say, this was a pleasure. This was fun. I had fun. I didn't feel like there was any pressure. So thank you both. You're both
Good.
super knowledgeable. And I appreciate the softball questions because I know that you could tell people the same thing. So I appreciate that. So what I would say in terms of plugs, like I do have a coaching business. I'm sure you guys do some coaching as well. If people want to apply, I take athletes on a rolling basis. They can apply through my website and we just have a conversation. I have athletes all over the world. And again, it's, kind of the classic individualized coaching, messaging, calls, whatever it is that they need. So if they have any, questions, they can just refer to my website or they can always reach out on Instagram or via the application online. So I really appreciate both of you having me. It was a pleasure and hopefully we'll run into each other. I've never been to Australia, but maybe I'll go.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, you gotta come.
I'm afraid of the creatures in Australia. They're creepy.
Oh no, we don't have bears like you, so I think you'll be right. You can step on a snake and it's fine. You can't step on a bear.
Well,
Do you have
yeah, but
bears, or is that Canada?
we do have bears, but you'll see the bear. You won't see the snake. That's what's scary.
No, you hear it slithering behind you, chasing you. But no, thank you so much. We appreciate your time as well, and yeah, just everything you do. It's so nice because I think it would be hard to be an academic doing the research you're doing, teaching all the time, and then still trying to find some time and energy to put out some Instagram content. It can be hard to balance both, I'm sure. But yeah, I think your students are very lucky to have you because we've just yeah found that all very captivating and engaging, and I think the listeners are going to get a lot out of it. So hopefully we can get you on for part two and get that double threshold happening.
Hey, I am happy to come back anytime. This was a pleasure. Hopefully next time my kids won't be screaming at me, but you never know. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it.